10:30 this morning, and a group of people are trying to get through a police cordon close to Whitehall.
Why when it's us? Why when it's us?
Why when it's us, they ask the police. That might be a reference to comments earlier this week from the Home Secretary. She said right-wing protesters were rightly met with a stern response from the police, while what she described as pro-Palestinian mobs were largely ignored. After a few minutes, the group break through the police cordon and spill out onto Whitehall. Men, some in balaclavas, form a line in the middle of the road as the armistice service is about to begin. They start chanting as veterans gather to pay their respects. According to the organisers, that disruption continued during the 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock. A stark contrast to the hopes expressed earlier.
I would like to think that our services this morning and any demonstration that does go ahead can both go ahead peacefully, and that the solemnness and the quiet that we would like this morning at 11 o'clock will not be disturbed.
The organisers say they're deeply disappointed by what they describe as the appalling and loutish behaviour, which they say showed great disrespect to the service. The former leader of the English Defence League, Tommy Robinson, filmed himself walking towards the cenotaph just before the armistice service.
And there's groups coming from every area and angle.
Afterwards, he got into a taxi and drove away. Some of those he was with later clashed with riot police in Chinatown. Ironically, it was the pro-Palestinian protesters who the police had banned from Whitehall to try to avoid disruption. Hundreds of thousands of people took part in the march calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It was held well away from Whitehall and deliberately timed to start after the armistice service. One of the organisers blamed rhetoric from the Home Secretary for encouraging the far right to try to disrupt proceedings.
We've never had those groups coming out all over the past 5 weeks, never. But when it became as if we are hate marchers against our own country, it became some kind of incentive for those right-wing groups, you know, just to come out and confront us.
It was the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who described events like these as hate marches. The Prime Minister has also called the timing of today's march disrespectful.
The organisers are well aware of the intense scrutiny they're under today. They say they have 700 stewards who are marshalling this event, and they've been told to challenge anyone displaying placards that are anti-Semitic or using language that is deemed offensive.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Many Jews find this chant, "From the river to the sea," deeply offensive, interpreting it as a desire for an end to the existence of Israel. Protesters, though, say it's simply a call for Palestinian rights to be respected. One of those taking part had been at the armistice service earlier on.
This morning was about the war dead, commemorating everyone that's created the conditions for us to have the democracy that we have. This afternoon, this is about an event that's happening which is completely and utterly disproportionate with regard to the number of people that are being killed.
Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove happened to be at Victoria Station as protesters held a brief sit-in. He had to get a police escort. The march organisers have asked protesters to peacefully disperse, but to leave in groups for their own safety.
Well, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has blamed the Home Secretary herself for the unrest, saying Suella Braverman's comments had made the police's job much harder. Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has called for her to resign, saying she'd emboldened the far right. She hasn't personally commented. Porrick O'Brien joins me now live from Whitehall. Porrick.
Kathy, that enormous police operation that Jane was talking about in her report is continuing. this evening, which is significant, especially for one Sir Mark Rowley, the head of the Metropolitan Police. There was a lot at stake here. He was under an enormous amount of pressure ahead of this demonstration, compliments of the Home Secretary. What was different about this demonstration compared to other Saturdays was the policing of the counter demonstrators, as Jane also mentioned in her report. The police strategy there, as we saw on the ground, was to detain and stop those counter protesters who were holed up in pubs and adjacent streets to the main route from getting anywhere near the route before they could potentially cause any violence. During last Saturday's pro-Palestinian demonstration, there were around 30 arrests, relatively few given the size of the crowd. Then a week of febrile debate in the lead up to this Remembrance Weekend, including contributions from the Home Secretary. Today, there have been almost 100 arrests so far. The majority were of counter-demonstrators, elements of the far-right and alt-right, football hooligan groups and others called on supporters to come to central London today. They arrived in their hundreds. The majority of arrests took place here on a street in Pimlico, central London, parallel to the pro-Palestinian march. Police detained a large group of men suspected of wanting to disrupt the main demonstration. This security operation isn't just about deploying large amounts of police officers on the street, it's about clever preemptive policing as well. So the main demonstration is passing by on a street just parallel to us here, and we've stumbled across this. The police have detained about 100 men. The worry, I assume, is that they would try to have interfered with the demonstration and caused a security incident. There were other small flashpoints on streets adjacent to the main route. Scuffles broke out, and as we were filming, one of the men outside the pub knocked the camera out of our hands. These sorts of scenes will prompt further questions about the future of the Home Secretary. If her job is to keep people safe, people will be asking whether her interventions this week made people more safe or less safe on the streets of the capital this weekend.
Joining me now is Steve Hartshorn, who's chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales. Steve Hartshorn, do you think that the Home Secretary whipped up anger and unrest among far-right protesters?
Good evening. First off, can I pay a tribute to my colleagues who've worked incredibly hard today at the protest and across the country, but also getting business as usual going. On your particular question, it's not for me to say whether the Home Secretary has. That's going to be a decision for the electorate, for members of Parliament and indeed the wider government to decide if those comments have inflamed the situation or not.
Well, this situation has clearly been inflamed, and the far-right protesters only mobilised after Suella Braverman made these comments about hate marches, and they echoed her very concerns about policing double standards. Bit of a coincidence, isn't it?
It is, and some people say there's no such thing as a coincidence in policing, but it's particularly ironic that today is Armistice Day, the day when it should be a reconciliation, you know, a cessation of hostilities, and yet we have violence shown towards police officers who are trying to protect and keep the King's peace.
Well, arguably the Home Secretary then put your officers in danger. Do you have confidence in her tonight? Do your officers?
Again, if I speak to my colleagues across the country, it's for them to voice their concerns around that. All I would say is that, as we've reiterated numerous times now, we want the politics to be kept well away and out of policing. We are there to do an operational job. We do it very, very well. And I think by the way that the protest has been policed today, that's an example of how we can get on and police these things. We're very good at it. There's always going to be outcomes that people don't like. However, I think my colleagues have done a really good job today. Well,
Suella Braverman's allies say that the disorder we saw on the streets today was because of the inability of the police to police property properly. You were suggesting that it's the political meddling that is in fact to blame?
For me, there's political interference when they start calling in the Commissioner, holding to account before anything's happened. It's vital that there is operational independence for those decision makers. And he hasn't just made this decision on his own. He will have had a team of advisors, legal advisors, tactical advisors, planners to make sure we get it right. It's about drawing a fine balance between people's right to attend and voice their concerns, but they cannot cross that threshold and break the law. And if they do, that's what my colleagues are there to deal with properly and professionally.
But political meddling made your job harder? Or was it your inability to police, as Suella Braverman's allies say?
For me, it's not about that inability to police. We do a really good job day in, day out on very complex situations. Obviously, our colleagues are briefed, but what doesn't happen is the public don't get briefed what they're supposed to do when we put in a cordon, tell them to go away. They've got their own decisions to make on how they react to what police officers do and ask them to do. It's a very, very difficult job, but I think they've done a good job today. And political interference we need to keep it away from policing, as I've already mentioned.
Do you think the police have been tough enough on the pro-Palestinian protesters today? Because, you know, again, Suella Braverman hasn't said anything publicly, but her friends in Westminster are drawing attention to the anti-Semitic banners they've seen, and the fact that one of her cabinet colleagues was surrounded at Victoria Station.
You'll forgive me, I'm not privy to some of the operational decisions or what's actually taken place on the ground. I've not been in central London today, but from the reports I've hearing, it seems to have gone off largely peacefully. Now, if there has been offences committed, there'll be a team of evidence gatherers nearby who will be capturing images, videos, taking statements. There may have well been some arrests on that side of it, which I'm not privy to. So I'm hoping there's been a proper balance struck to make sure that both sides are kept content with the policing operation, but obviously we're never going to please everybody.
Steve Hartshorn, thanks very much for joining us.